In the dream of the cold restaurant. The man with the buttonhole and broad lapels is folding and refolding a white napkin. Look, say his hands at intervals. A swan, a dancing girl, an intricate scale model of the Morn Library on Chancery Lane. The man adjusts his buttonhole and coughs as each one fails precisely to entertain. A waitress intervenes, bringing 2 plates. Fluted, plain, translucent, and quite empty. Such is the gaunt extravagance of dreams. That waitress, though, all elbows, wrists and hips. A strip of exposed skin reveals a scar on the nub of bone that finishes the spine. No, not a scar. A burn. A full-blown wet rosette, just like the one you earned at 17 from a fuck on a nylon carpet. A carpet not unlike this carpet here, lalling its beige hoops and braids around the table's feet. Meanwhile, on the mezzanine, someone lifts a book and reads the line, "He left his knee exposed and dreamed of travelling on a mail coach by night." Well, quite. When you offer up your plate, it turns beneath your hands to a crumpled swan. The man, of course, has gone. Such is the glib economy of dreams. So find a way to bear it, if you can. The man who folds and cannot please. The cheap carpet telling its idiot riddle. The girl who has not learned to move between compassion and contempt. But then other people's dreams are very dull, as the waitress knows, with all the brutal certainty of being 17. And she's gone too. She'll pull this city to the ground before she'll take your plate, let alone your pity.
Hello, Abby. I'd like to ask you a few questions, if I may.
Of course.
And the first one is, there was intriguing wordplay in both Jinx and I Think We're Alone Now. I've read about your toy-making past and even watched a past interview about your residency as part of a Nottingham Video Games Festival. I found your poetry mesmerising and unique, and I just wondered what draws you to write about a subject, incident or observation.
That is a very generous question, and I hope I can give a satisfactory answer. So I guess one answer is that poems almost always begin for me as obsessions, as fixations, excruciations, something that I worry about or just can't let go of for whatever reason. And I think this is something you can lean into and something I've learned to lean into. I think, for me at least, it helps to have an obsessive cast of mind. Because to obsess over something, to carry it around with you, makes the thing, be it an idea or a daft little phrase, it makes it behave as if it has its own gravity, and it ends up sucking everything into its orbit as you go about the daily business of your life. If you've had a crush, then you'll be familiar with the experience, right? And so a lot of the time, that's where poems begin for me, is there's something running in the background as an obsession, pulling things into its orbit. That's one part of it. On the other hand, I think I think you also, I think there is a way in which you have to be in some way open, receptive, or just vulnerable to writing, to being able to write about something, to writing about it. I was talking to my friend Christopher about this just the other day. He's just put out this excellent book about his own childhood. But it's taken until now, even though he's always had that with him, it's taken until now for this to be the right time for him to write that. And so it's a two-part thing, really. There's the obsession that you cart around with you, and then I guess I would think of that as like the premonitory work for the poem. And then there's the, for want of a better term, inciting event, the thing that means now is the right time, right? And I think that event can be something as apparently inconsequential as an offhand comment from a friend that will cue you into the fact that you have been carrying around this thing, that you have been worrying and working for all this time. That's interesting. That's interesting to me. And so that's the sweet spot, I suppose. There'll be something that will cue me into the fact that I've been obsessing over something for a long time. And so, yeah, I guess that's how, for me at least, that's the way into poems. That there'll be something I encounter that in some way resonates at the same frequency as some kind of alarm signal going off in me. And I think this must be how it is for other people as well, because we always draw on those kind of metaphors of congruence when we talk about inspiration. We talk about something striking a chord with us, or we say it resonates with me. So I hope that's a useful answer. Axonometric. I know you understood that space to mean your negative, dark bolt of antimatter cut to fit, a wounding suit of lights turned inside out. The ego will not countenance the scene that won't return its gaze. Let me explain, or let me try. Increasingly, I think of what we say as a field of broken signposts, or wind-blown semaphore, or just bellowed through a keyhole. But it hurts to think that you think of yourself in punched-out sequins, mats and dead-eye feathers, and I want to get this straight. I've thought a lot, just lately, about the double life of doors and locks and all the two-way apparatus of control. In Spanish, there are different kinds of corner. The outside one, the one you turn around, and the one you sit or slump in, which by extension means you're out of options. Rincon, that little nook, stopped and shut. That isn't right. But if I talk around it, we'll get the formal scope of it in dashes and ellipses. You know the trick. Just blur the mind a little and feel around the rooms we've built between us, with their door codes and their dress codes, with their twists on you and me. Let's tell the truth in this one. Let's agree I liked myself, refracted in your eyes. A switch and Mourneval and eel spear, 9 heads and 9 glass cabinets, or 9 lives knotted round a single cat. A ransacked drawer of costumes and positions and shadowboxing rabbits, games and parlour tricks and military tactics. A stack of hand-me-downs that don't quite fit. That's more like it. And something in the Highways Act I read the other day. A door which opens on a street shall be so put as not to open outwards, which by extension means it opens inwards. Yes, you've got it, says the grown-up girl in her sudden shrunken house, with one arm jammed against the only exit.
I recently heard you read the startling poem "Whatever Happened to Rosemary." I'd love to know what the poem is about or how it came about.
I think it's quite a simple answer. As previously mentioned, I love pop, and I love bubblegum pop. And I especially love bubblegum pop from that era, from the late 50s, early 60s. And that particular song is a Connie Francis song from 1963. And I'd listened to it a number of times, and to explain, if you're not familiar with the song, the burden of the song is a girl saying to her prospective boyfriend that she's, she's ready now. She's ready to go steady. In fact, that's the principal rhyme of the first verse. But there's this one thing that she wants to know, which is she's heard about this other girl that used to be around called Rosemary, and what she really wants to know is whatever happened to Rosemary. I want to know about that girl, and that line, whatever happened to Rosemary, is the name of the song. It's the refrain, and the word Rosemary is also quite a lot of the lyrics. There are whole bits of the song where it's just Connie Francis singing the name Rosemary over and over again. And I love digging subtext out of anything, including bubblegum pop. And so over successive listens, it occurred to me that the really interesting relationship in that song is not between this girl and her prospective boyfriend. It's between this girl and Rosemary. Like, why does she keep going on about Rosemary, right? And so that's the simple answer. I guess the answer sitting underneath that is that I've always been really interested in the idea of female jealousy, of jealousy. I'm going to have to stop that because I don't think I've thought that out very clearly. But I am very interested in female jealousy. But I wonder if I can articulate that better. Let me think. No, I think that might be one for another day, if you don't mind, Taz. Whatever happened to Rosemary? Your song is on the radio again, Rosemary. The one where every other line is Rosemary, Rosemary. He acts like he can't hear it, but I see it, Rosemary. How the backrooms of his brain have all lit up with Rosemary. A 10-foot neon sign, and it's flashing Rosemary in 10-foot neon letters that go Rose and Ma and E. And he's turning drunken circles arm in arm with Rosemary in a seedy little dive bar. And the bar's called Rosemary's. I found a load of photographs. They're all of Rosemary. He keeps them in an album labelled Me and Rosemary. There's a little punctured heart above the R of Rosemary, and it lives beneath the bed you chose together, Rosemary, the bed he shares with me. And he mumbles Rosemary while he's asleep and dreaming all his dreams of Rosemary. And I can't quite shake the feeling I'm intruding Rosemary when the springs inside the mattress squeal Rosemary, Rosemary. There's a signpost in his heart that points the way to Rosemary, and beside it there's a suitcase that belonged to Rosemary, and inside it there's a pocketbook inscribed with Rosemary, with 2 tickets for the steamer ship, the SS Rosemary. Yes, the past's a foreign country, and its queen is Rosemary, and he worships at the altar of its Venus Rosemary. I can't understand the language, every word is Rosemary, and the picture in my passport couldn't pass for Rosemary. Someone sack the archer, he's obsessed with Rosemary. And every dart is loaded with that poison Rosemary. In every corner of my heart, there's a knife for Rosemary. And they've all got secret nicknames, but the nickname's Rosemary. And in this light, and if I squint, he looks a bit like Rosemary. Just add a bit of lipstick. Yes, like that. Like Rosemary. Now tell me that you love me. Say your name is Rosemary. And kiss me like she kisses. Say I'm yours. My Rosemary.
I wanted to ask if the brilliant wordplay running through your poems is a conscious poetic device, a style, or perhaps a method of documentation that has naturally arrived.
Oh, this is such an interesting question. So I guess when we're talking about wordplay, what we tend to be talking about are those things like punning and rhyme, and all those different ways in which the writer can make you see that 2 things you thought of as distinct actually belong at the same neural address, are in some way the same. And as to whether that's conscious or not, I think certainly the way into it is to look past the semantic life of the word towards all those other lives it's living simultaneously, the phonic and the typographical and the rhythmic life of language, of this sort of variably resistant material that we're all using all the time to communicate with one another. And is that conscious or not? I mean, one answer I would give to this is that I tick. I'm someone who ticks. And this is something that if I'm in public, if we're speaking now, I tend to camouflage. But if I'm on my own, I don't. And so I have a range of motor tics that are enacted physically, but also a range of what you might term verbal or vocal tics, which term you pick is, I guess, up for debate, since I think there is some sort of debate as to whether they contain language content. And because I have tics all my life, so I've often been surprised by a language event I perhaps did not, strictly speaking, intend, or perhaps the intention is an interesting matter, let's say. I suppose I've been very used all my life to treating language as material, as not only having this semantic life, as being in some way promiscuous. So that wordplay, that tendency to treat language as a sensational event, if you like, something that has a sensational component, is something that I have always done. So I honestly don't know whether that means that a tendency towards picking up these aspects of language is conscious or not. There's a really brilliant essay by the writer Ronald Schleifer called The Poetics of Tourette Syndrome, where he says that poetry is all about picking up and using the material redundancies of languages. This is his term. So all those things that we've just talked about, all those things that are not the strict semantic life of the word. And this is also something that happens when you are ticking vocally, that you're not, strictly speaking, dealing in the semantic life of language. It is an event nonetheless. So that is a very complex answer to the question, I guess. I don't know to what degree it's conscious. Heaney has this fantastic term where he talks about the poet bringing these resonances within language into half-deliberate play, and that to me seems right, half-deliberate play. I think it's something you can be conscious of and alert to and work with without being in full control, if you like, in full control.
Does this sort of mean that perhaps this is sort of like what I meant to say was that has there been change or evolutions to this approach between the two collections? Would you say that, or you haven't noticed any change in your approach to Jinx, or I think we're alone now?
I did notice a difference, but I mean, writers are notoriously bad at tracing these changes in their own work. So I'd be interested to know if you feel there is a difference. This second book, I think We're Alone Now, is still incredibly new to me. And certainly to my mind, the second book feels much more prosy, much more propositional. There's quite a lot of quite strenuous explanation, I suppose. There are a lot of turns in the poems that are actually stating, let me explain, I want to explain. I don't really know how to account for that, except that the book came about because I was offered a remit within which to work, and it was one I found extremely difficult. And so a lot of the time when I was working towards this book, I was myself fighting through what I understood and didn't understand of the idea that I had been gifted, which was I'd been asked to write on the idea of intimacy. And so I suppose in that sense, the poems in Jinx felt, to me at least, felt more fluent, less halting in that way, because I was just working with all my own obsessions and writing love letters to things that I found exciting. Whereas in I Think We're Alone Now, I found it a struggle towards meaning. Does that make sense?
I think as someone who is still a relatively new reader, for me Jinx was sort of there's a rhythmic pattern to Jinx which is kind of very pleasing to the ear, and this latest I think it has more musicality. That's the only way I can kind of look at it really, that it feels like there's even more depth, but perhaps it's more relatable for, or maybe that, when I first read Jinx, it was sort of like I was reading so many collections and in a short space of time, whereas because this has been a much more relaxed read, that it feels there's an intimacy to it, which although the first one was about intimacy, in a sense, you sense more of that intimate voice in the latest collection. I don't know if that's an accurate kind of
the second book was written after I'd read an interview with Nicholas Laughlin. He's a poet I admire very much, in which he'd said that his ideal for a poem is that it should feel both improbable and inevitable, that it should trouble your sense of mental privacy, like, how did you know? and now I carry that around as a touchstone. I think that's just right. But I do also want to ask you, if you don't mind, Daz, about this question of wordplay, because actually what I know of your work, this is also something that's if I say a vexation, then I guess I mean a fascination in your work. You often work with internal rhyme and that kind of echoing, and especially between languages. So do you feel it's conscious?
I think, first of all, thank you for actually reading anything by me. I tend to look at the difference in the way language came about. Say, for instance, the Sumerian kind of writing and the way language is kind of linked around a description of words or acts, and Egyptian hieroglyphics is very much like that. And I think because I'm very interested in the Near East, and that is my academic background, so inevitably I think I unconsciously kind of latch on to multiple meanings and possibilities of words, which may be quite distant from our contemporary understanding of what is a word or a phrase.
Yes,
I don't know if that makes sense at all.
No, that makes perfect sense. That's interesting. I'm not sure whose phrase it is, the ramifying sense potential, but I like it. Let's have it.
Thank you. How did poetry begin? A past interview states something about wanting to be a blood axe poet, specifically at the age of 13 or 14.
I guess those are two slightly different questions. The very first one, how did it begin? I mean, that's an interesting one to answer because I guess I have quite a complex and vexed relationship with control, like a lot of writers, like a lot of people. And to me, or for me, putting something into words and finding the right words to do that has always felt like quite a necessary reconciliation. So in that sense, I guess that impulse towards poetry is one that goes back quite a long way for me. And when I look back to my early childhood, all the stuff of poetry, I guess, was there. I grew up in quite a busy household, and we were not the sort of family who would like read poetry to each other, but we were very invested in rhymes and ditties and like verbal games, and also in music, like like pop music especially. You know, it was very common to sit around the supper table and collectively try and recall all the lyrics to a song and shout over each other and contradict each other and you know and say no you've heard that wrong, and work collaboratively in that way towards something. And also there was a lot of music played at home, and so all of those I would think of as things that go into a relationship with language that lends itself towards the making of poems. I don't know why I felt the need to disarticulate that so elaborately. There's this line I really love at Middlemarch where one of the characters says that he can't bear to listen to pop music because it makes the words in his head dance a little minuet. And I'm very familiar with that experience, but unlike Casabon, I really welcome that experience. In fact, I frequently find my thoughts conforming to scraps of song, scraps of rhythm. And so where did it begin? I'm not entirely sure. I'm grateful to have grown up in quite a noisy, chaotic household, where a lot of those things were happening, and which I would think of as, I guess, being an early experience and the sort of things I now recognise as being the stuff of poetry. It's one of those weird things, Taz, because like at some stage or another you're going to be asked about your influences, and I always come up with what I hope is a credible answer. But really what I'm thinking is, what it comes down to is, very early on, a lot of pop music, a lot of hymns. Like I went to a school where you would sing hymns. So it's mostly those two things, I think, that are the compost, if you like. So where did poetry begin? And then it is a slightly obtuse answer, because I think perhaps you're asking more about the business of consciously writing poems and thinking of them as poems. And for me that began, I can pinpoint the exact point. For a couple of years when I was at school, I had this really excellent English teacher who clearly read contemporary poetry and would give it to us to look at. And she one day brought in a poem by a poet I'd never heard of. I did not read contemporary poetry. I never came across contemporary poetry, really. And the poet was called Maura Dooley. And it was a poem called History. And it was given to us as an unseen poem. And I'd never really experienced anything quite like it. And in retrospect, I guess what felt revelatory about being given that poem was that you could appreciate what it was doing as the experience of enchantment. Like a poem works a spell, right? All writing works a spell. So you could give yourself over to this experience of enchantment at the same time as approaching it as something that operated more like an engine that could be taken apart, disassembled, stress tested. You could look at all the different parts were doing. And so I guess that was the first time I'd encountered this double life of the poem, that it works like a spell and it works like an engine. And those two things somehow are compatible, which I still find phenomenally exciting. And so I think I first started thinking carefully, thinking seriously, if you like, about what poems do and how they work then. I think I went home and I must have begged one of my aunts to buy me some contemporary poetry, because that's what I got that Christmas, was a big Blood Axe anthology. which I still have, and which still has all my Marmitey fingerprints all around the pages, because I must have read it cover to cover so many times. So I think that was the first. I think that was the first time I thought of poetry as something happening right now, being written by people who were alive and whom you could meet even. And in fact, one of the nice consequences of that is that Maura and I later became good friends. She was my supervisor when I was doing my PhD. Obviously, I had some hand in that. Okay, she was someone I'd looked up to from that point, and we're now very good. We're now very good friends. So, this poem has an epigraph from the artist M.C. Escher, so I'll read that first. The epigraph is: "It remains an extremely absorbing activity, a real mania to which I have become addicted, and from which I sometimes find it hard to tear myself away." The Fly Dresser's Guide. The blue chatterer, for instance, spook neon, rare as radium. The lithogram cannot hope to reproduce its brilliantine, but there are some 300 specimens housed at Tring in the Museum of the Natural Sciences, should Sir wish to see them. Think of their collector, who marvelled that such miracles occurred, with no intelligent eye to gaze upon their loveliness. A collection, incidentally, once plundered by a young man with a diamond saw and a dazzling obsession. How close we come to mania. The work itself, of course, the glass conservatoire in which two supple arias are ravelled round the task. But, sir, I know an initiate when I see one. How else to feel the fluent kindling, the ignition? How else to know the upshot scuffle of the will, the great detective and his rival going at it on the Reichenbach, our little livid echo of the angel who rebels and falls, pinwheeling from heaven? How close we come to ruin. But, sir, you felt its glimmer, coming over Cadair Idris to Talachlin, down there in the night cold, the intricate scape of cleft and structure, the prize that clasps itself into itself, its snapshot gem case.
According to the blurb of I Think We Are Alone Now, this second collection is about certain failures. But reading it, I felt what a celebration of failures these interesting, pithy, and at times stunning poems are. How did this collection come about?
It came about via a series of failures, which is, I guess, in part why that idea looms so large in both the book and the blurb. So at its inception, as I think I've mentioned in another answer, this was originally a topic I was asked to write about. Originally, this was going to be a stage show, and it was one of those briefs, fantastically generous, completely terrifying, where really I could have written almost anything I wanted to. I was given a great deal of latitude, with the result that I found it extremely difficult to write anything. And so for a long time after I was offered this brief, I couldn't write anything, and I got very tangled up in this concern that I felt I didn't understand anything about the idea I was asked to write about, this idea of intimacy. I couldn't fix on, I thought at the time I believed this was important, I couldn't fix on a working definition, and without that I felt like I couldn't even embark on the project of writing the thing. And so having had this period where instead of instead of writing, I just read. I read everything I could on the topic, and the more I read, the further I felt from the topic itself. And then, having come up empty-handed myself by means more or less devious, I ended up just saying, right, I'm going to ask other people what they think instead. And I was walking with a very old friend of mine, and he asked how the thing was going, and I said, oh, it's not going at all. I don't even know how to start. I don't think I even know what intimacy is. And which sounds like a really obtuse thing to say, right? To be absolutely clear, I think I feel I would recognise intimacy if I encountered it, but that's not the same as having something to work with as an idea. And so, having sort of thrown up my arms to a friend and said, I what do you think it is? He thought about it for a moment, and he said, oh, I'm not going to tell you. You'll think it's silly. And I said, no, I promise I won't. I promise I won't. And he said, well, the first thing I think of is a dog rolling over and exposing its belly. And I said, yes. I think so too. Or at least that's part of the conversation I would have with myself about what intimacy is, or feels like, if you like. And so after that, I just started asking everyone I know the same question. Like, what do you think intimacy is? What's the first thing you think of? How would you define intimacy? And I had the most extraordinary answers. And it's like, one of the really amazing things about this was how willing people were to talk about this, and how quickly you found yourself in a very intimate conversation once you have asked this question. Just some fascinating answers, and in fact what I'd really like is to be able to compile a book of all the answers that I was offered. I have a cousin who works as a tailor, and he had some particularly fascinating stories because, as he pointed out, the things that people tell their tailor, because there's this like very strange social jam between the intimacy and the formality of the occasion. And so he said that people essentially treat it like they're in, like it's confession. And so that was very interesting. And anyway, there's a very roundabout way of saying that was when I started work on the book. But really I'd had to fail first before realising that actually my sitting at home with a pile of books was no way to take on the topic of intimacy, and that really this had to happen in conversation. And so failure in that sense, but also failure in the sense that certainly a lifelong session for me has been this problem of whether or not when you speak, when you write, when you communicate, whether or not you can know that what you said or what you meant to say is what was understood, and vice versa. So I've always been interested for that reason in the different ways that communication itself can fail, that a meaning might be missed, misheard, misunderstood. I guess because I think of conversation, of groping towards meaning as quite messy and quite collaborative. And so this, I guess, persisted through the writing of the book as an enduring fixation, that idea of failure, that idea of what we fail to communicate.
I wanted to ask you about whether moving to Wales has changed, or maybe if there is any discernible alteration in how you approach poetry.
There is one very, very specific sense in which it's exerted an influence, which is that one of the first things I did after moving here was to try to learn Welsh. And I mean, I am interested in language learning, but Welsh is, I think, is the language that is most radically different from English that I've tried to learn, even in its rudiments, let's say. And so through a lot of the time that I was writing I Think We're Alone Now, I was trying to learn Welsh. And there's a sequence of poems in the book that I suppose directly came out of that experience, which is there's a sequence called Marginal Glosses, which is not about the Welsh language per se, but it is, if anything really, it's about the English language and the metaphors that we're deploying all the time when we express ourselves in English. Like, for example, if we use the verb deploy instead of use, that's always been interesting to me. And one of the great values for me of learning another language is the way in which that alienates you from certain runnels of thought that you take for granted, the metaphors you use without thinking about the fact that you're using them. So in that sense, though, it exerted this very direct influence on the book because I was thinking very, very carefully about my own first language, English, in a way that I hadn't before. Some remarks on the general theory of relativity. Space, it turns out, curves. Space itself. And time does too, or rather space and time together curve and stretch wherever there is matter. And this has always been the case, but no one thought to tell me. Practically, this means that if I lived up a mountain and my twin lived by the sea, then one or other of us would be younger than the other. I don't have a twin. I've got an older brother who says we never landed on the moon. An uncle who thinks aliens are farming us as food, who says the end is coming and coming very soon. An aunt who liked cocaine, who had the 7 sisters tattooed across her back when she got clean. And a father who took off like a comet when he could, who won't be coming back this way again, not in this life. As for me, my sense of things in general is loosely sentimental. And outer space, with all its borderkin of quark and anti-quark and light and dark, is no exception. I like the bits that look like us, that look like human things. A little spooky action. Some unexpected pairing locked in formal equilibrium. I like the null and void of a black hole, but only, let's be honest, as a vehicle where the tenor is depression. Beyond that, I find I'm fairly chilled by distances and zeros, by emptiness and lack, by the eerie little whine in the word vacuum. Last night, washing dishes, I looked up to see my neighbour staring at her sink with all her dishes piled beside her, a mirror trick configured by the way the houses here have bending round each other. Our paths don't ever cross. We keep our different hours, but the houses here are small, the walls are thin. I hear her talking sometimes on the phone. I hear her cough at night. I hear the little clunk of the cabinet in her bathroom, the same cheap bathroom cabinet that I have in my bathroom, the same cheap clunking cabinet all landlords put in flats. And yes, I must assume she hears that little clunk. She hears me cough at night. She hears me talking sometimes on the phone. She's thought, these walls are thin. She's looked up from her sink to see her twin in a square of yellow kitchen light with 10 dark feet between. Then the knife edge found my finger and it came up red and sudden. That scandalous reminder of all that ties us down and ropes us off from one another.